If you are interested in the currents in the esoteric ferment, you will not have missed the fact that most people with an esoteric worldview often side with the attacker, not the attacked, after the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Let's think together about what could be the cause of this interesting phenomenon. Historical and cultural connections. Esotericists may have strong historical or cultural ties to Russia or post-Soviet states that may influence their perception of the conflict. These connections may manifest through shared historical roots, the influence of orthodoxy, rich esoteric and mystical traditions in Russia, romanticization of Russian culture, or identification with historical narratives glorifying Russian history and culture. The figure of Rasputin, a controversial mystic and confidant of the Tsarist family in pre-revolutionary Russia, is a case in point. Often seen as an esoteric and mystical figure, Rasputin influenced the politics and society of his time through his close ties to the Tsarist family. His presence in Russian history and his association with the Orthodox Church and esoteric practices provide an example of how historical and cultural factors can shape the perceptions of esotericists. His figure and legacy may be idealized or romanticized in some contemporary esoteric circles, which may see him in the era in which he lived as an example of a spiritual or mystical Russia. This idealized perception of Rasputin and Tsarist Russia may create cultural and spiritual connections that may influence some esotericists' attitudes toward current events in Russia, including the conflict in Ukraine. Religious and spiritual beliefs. Esoteric beliefs may be associated with certain religious or spiritual traditions, which may lead to the interpretation of political events in the context of these beliefs. This may include spiritual interpretations of conflict, eschatological and apocalyptic views, moral and ethical assessments of events, or the influence of spiritual leaders and teachers. Here we can take as an example a fictional group of spiritual practitioners who subscribe to a particular esoteric teaching combining elements of Christianity and ancient mystical traditions. This group may interpret events such as the conflict in Ukraine through the prism of their eschatological beliefs. An example would be viewing the conflict as part of the final struggle between good and evil, which is seen as a precursor to the apocalyptic events foretold in their spiritual texts. In this group, a charismatic spiritual leader who interprets current events as the fulfillment of prophecy or as an important part of a divine plan can be very influential. His or her interpretation and moral assessment of the conflict, for example, seeing one side as representing good and the other as evil, can strongly influence the views of his or her followers and thus shape their attitudes toward the war. In this way, esoteric views that are strongly associated with religious or spiritual traditions can influence the interpretation and perception of international political events, often through the filter of their own spiritual beliefs and interpretations. Alternative worldview. Esotericists often approach reality from a perspective that emphasizes the metaphysical or spiritual aspects of existence. This alternative perception can lead to symbolic and archetypal interpretations, differing views of history and politics, an emphasis on personal spiritual journey and experience, and the perception of reality as an illusion or game. Here we can imagine how alternative perceptions of the world can affect esotericists in the context of political events. There could be a group of people who believe in astrology and its influence on world events. This group could interpret the conflict in Ukraine through astrological constellations and planetary movements. For example, they might believe that a certain planetary alignment, such as the retrograde motion of Mars, symbolizes or predicts a period of conflict and violence on Earth. This astrological interpretation could lead members of this group to view war events not as random or merely political, but as part of a larger cosmic plan or cycle. There could be a leader or influential member within this group who would use astrology to explain political events and offer advice to his followers on how to prepare for or respond to these events from a spiritual perspective. For example, he might recommend meditation or rituals to help balance the energy field or bring peace in accordance with his astrological perception of the conflict. This example shows how alternative perceptions of the world, in this case through astrology, can lead to very different interpretations and responses to international political events, with the emphasis being on the metaphysical and spiritual aspects of existence. Conspiracy theories and disinformation. In esoteric circles there can be a high degree of openness to alternative explanations of events, which may include the acceptance of conspiracy theories or disinformation. This factor may be reinforced by skepticism of official narratives, the influence of social media and online communities, association with political ideologies, the need for simple answers to complex questions, or the psychological appeal of conspiracy theories. Personal gain and influence. Some esotericists may see support for Russia as a means to gain personal gain or influence. This may include seeking financial gain, increasing social and political influence, identifying with powerful groups, creating controversy to increase attention, promoting personal ideological or spiritual agendas, or using conflict for personal growth or learning. It is important to emphasize, however, that the above motives are not universally applicable to all esoterics and cannot be used to generalize an entire group. What seems particularly important is that nowadays, information technology and social media are so widespread that it becomes easier for the creators of disinformation campaigns to target specific communities, including esoteric and conspiratorial ones. Here are a few key points that support this possibility. Esoteric and conspiratorial communities as disinformation targets. These communities may be particularly receptive to alternative explanations and narratives, making them attractive targets for disinformation campaigns. Propaganda information can be tailored to resonate with pre-existing beliefs and narratives in these groups. Taking the lead in discourse, disinformation sources may use techniques such as manipulation of facts or emotional appeals to take the lead in discourse in these communities. This can influence how certain events, such as the conflict in Ukraine, are perceived and interpreted. Pre-prepared ground for disinformation. Since many esoteric and conspiracy circles already tend to be open to alternative or unconventional explanations of events, it may be easier for disinformers to seed propaganda information into this pre-prepared ground. Considering information credible because of its source, people in these communities may tend to trust information that comes from sources they trust or are close to, which may include social media, alternative news sites, or influential figures in their community. This can lead to misinformation being accepted without sufficient critical thinking or verification. This scenario highlights the complexities and challenges associated with navigating the modern information space, where misinformation can play a significant role in influencing the opinions and attitudes of individuals and groups.